Alright guys, TouchGrabber back again today. Hope you're enjoying your day so far once again, and today we are going to talk about Call of Duty professional player salaries. It's no secret that with the franchise league coming into play with Modern Warfare, a lot of these players are making a lot more money than they used to back in the day. You think back to Black Ops 2, Ghost, even up to like Advanced Warfare Black Ops 3, these guys would be turning up to tournaments. If they didn't take home the victory, they wouldn't have the money to pay their rent, right? Which is a big deal, and we've talked about a number of complications with this really, how back in the day, players had to try so hard and they would always go super hard in practice because this money was their livelihoods. Nowadays, they've got guaranteed contracts, they're making a load more money than they used to, and it's having some issues on some of their like competitive drive, I suppose, just sitting on these teams and trying to maintain their spot, to maintain their salary, rather than being the best player they can be and win championships, because they don't necessarily need the prize money anymore, even though it's nice to have in addition to just the base salary. So we're going to talk about what some of the base salaries have been through the Modern Warfare season, and how they seem to be being significantly reduced for this season going into Black Ops Cold War, which certainly is something of a market correction. I think it's going to be a good deal in the long run, but also there's this discussion which went around yesterday. Should these players' salaries be made public knowledge? We're going to talk about exactly why that's a discussion with Henry G and the Cloud9 Esports Counter-Strike Global Offensive team. Do you think that would be a good thing to see in Call of Duty? Do you think it's like private between the players and, well, it shouldn't be necessarily public information? Or do you think if we want to be a proper sports league, and, well, pretty much in sports you hear about these players' salaries being very public information and publicly disclosed. We're going to talk about some rumors as to what some of the salaries are for some of these players today. Nothing guaranteed here, like the things I'm going to talk about I've pieced together from things that have been said behind the scenes, and I've heard from different sources over the course of the year, that none of this is guaranteed to be accurate, of course, but we're going to talk about what these kind of players are kind of making and what they may be making next season. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like if you enjoy it, subscribe if you are new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. Let's just set the scene really quick. So Henry G, who's one of the greatest CSGO commentators of all time, that being Counter-Strike Global Offensive, he retired from casting just a few days ago. He won like a esports broadcaster, like commentator of the year in 2019, just the year after I think Maven won it actually, so shout out the Call of Duty boys. And he's gone over to Cloud9, who've had a bit of a disaster of their CSGO team over the last couple of years since they won the Boston Major at the start of 2018, to be like their kind of general manager, and he's really switching up exactly how this organization is being run. So yesterday, they announced Alex, one of the players, onto this new Counter-Strike team, and in Counter-Strike they're making a lot more money than these Call of Duty players. We'll just point that out for now. But, you know, contract length 3-year deal value 1.65 million, so over $500,000 a year, being very clear about why they've picked him up and what the deal value is, how much money this guy's making, so to some degree, they can be held accountable. There is issues with doing this, right? Like, there's not many benefits to it as an organization if you don't have to. Yes, it increases the transparency, but at the same time, if you know how much you're paying the players, or if everyone knows how much you're paying the players, then if they start not to perform, then all of a sudden, like, people are in the Twitch chat saying like 1.65 million a mega lol and all this kind of stuff, and yeah, maybe it doesn't look so good to some degree, but I do appreciate the transparency. So a few people were saying as a result of this, Methods comes out, of course, with the Toronto Ultra, and says, with the news of Cloud9 making salaries public, curious as to why all esports salaries are not public already. Clayster says a similar thing, love this, wish it was more commonplace and not so taboo to talk about salaries. Cronut CDL Intel then comes out and says, you know, would you like to see them made public? And, well, most people say yes in this one. So, of course, there was some interesting discussion in the replies. I mean, you know, screw the salaries, I want to see how much Octane Sam has been fined. So, intrigued to hear your thoughts on the comment section below. Do you think salaries should be public? Is it like private knowledge, really, or, you know, between the players and the organization? Or if we want to be a real sport, do we have to get to a point where salaries are then made public in the near future? And is that a possibility over the next couple of years? Maybe it's not completely out of the question. So I thought what I'd do is I'd bring up the players that were in the league last season and kind of look at what these guys were making on average. So the rumor has it that the average player in the league, some of these guys on the LAG, or, you know, the average kind of situation in the league, was roughly making 10 to 12 grand a month, something in that ballpark. So 10 grand a month roughly works out as 120 grand a year. This is in US dollars, up to about 144 grand a year, something like that is in terms of the ballpark. So 120 to 140,000 dollars, something like the average salary in the league. Some of these guys making a lot more than that though, and the ones I put rings around here are the names that I've heard certainly making a fair bit more than that. So Simp, I believe, on Atlanta FaZe, I'm not exactly sure about this, but I imagine he got a massive contract after the year that he had on a United going onto this team, and FaZe have a fair bit of money behind them as well. As you can see, I've completely rung the Huntsman and the Empire because I'm not really sure how this situation works out, but the rumor has it, at least let's look at Scump and Formal, because these, I guess, are the two big names on the Chicago Huntsman last season. Not exactly sure what type of of contract Gunless was on or anything like that, but maybe they paid a fair bit of money to get him, and Arstees, of course, from the United squad, they might have paid him a fair bit of change as well. But Scump and Formal rumoured to be on like almost $500,000. I think Formal I heard like $400,000, something like that. Scump maybe a little bit higher than that, I imagine. And yeah, that's kind of the ballpark of the highest paid players in the entire league, I think. I think Clayster's probably on something similar. I mean, there was a discussion on the ESPN podcast recently, or he did an interview with them saying like he's a really expensive player in terms of what his contract is for the Empire, and he had some offers going on to potentially some other teams, which I imagine was Atlanta FaZe, because I think he wanted to play again with Sypien and Beezy, and yeah, he was saying that they just couldn't afford my salary, because if they want to buy me out from Empire, effectively people are asking the question as to how these contract extensions work. So Clayster has technically been extended on the Empire, but will not be staying on that team, of course. So what it means is he's extended with his 1+1 contract, and then another organization has to buy out that contract from the Dallas Empire, meaning they have to pay him the salary that Dallas Empire have agreed for the previous season. So New York Subliners are going to be cashing out a lot of change for Clayster here, and it looked like FaZe couldn't really afford the salary that Empire have to pay Clayster by extending him on next season. But Clayster might be making in a similar region to that, say $400,000 a year or something in that ballpark. Not exactly sure, but I Hastro's talked about how these guys have paid a lot of money, and if it's kind of up to $500,000 in terms of what the salary is looking like at the very upper end, then I imagine Clayster, Crimsix, and some of these guys are in that kind of ballpark. Royal Ravens, we've also heard that they pay these guys pretty handsomely. I think Scraps was rumored to be around $300K, something like that. Dashy talked about, or Kenny talked about with Dashy in just earlier today's video, that Dashy was on a really a really high-powered contract, which I'm not frankly surprised given his season he had in the Black Ops 4 season, and he was making so much money that he didn't even need to try and practice, right, and get onto the Chicago Huntsmen next season. And also Seattle Surge, and I'm sure there's a few other names here that I'm missing, but Seattle Surge were rumored to be paid pretty handsomely as well, and pretty tragic how this team worked out, frankly, given you've had Karma on the team at the start of the season. Octane, of course, who I imagine had a big buyout, and I imagine they paid a lot of money for him in terms of salary, so imagine these guys were certainly above average, especially given the names they had on their team at the start of the season. And Nabel, of course, from 100 Thieves as well. Karma when he was on the team at the time. I imagine the substitutes being Panda and Proto weren't paid too much, but Seattle, I think, did pay a pretty penny, let's just say, for their players last season. So, as we can see, the kind of average 120K last season, at the upper end, maybe almost $500,000, somewhere in that ballpark. However, this season, I do believe it's going to be a very different story, because a number of these teams are cutting down, of course, to 4 versus 4. Pretty happy with the 4 versus 4 situation, I imagine, a lot of these teams, because they can now get to a point where they can pay less players, and also to pay those players less, right? And I think this is a good market correction, because we've seen over the last couple of years that these salaries have kind of got out of control, and these players are just making so much money. And okay, you can say 120 grand is not that much compared to some other occupations, but given where Call of Duty is and the potential revenue like that can come back from it right now, and the TV rights deals aren't there like a traditional sport is, it's a pretty, it's a lot of money for these guys to be making, especially compared to what they were making just a few years ago. I remember Clayster talked about back in like Ghost or Black Ops 2, he signed a contract with Complexity, and that was like the best team of all time at the time for something like $500 a month, like $6 grand a year. These guys are making back in like 2013, and now some of them are making not too far shy of 100 times that money just a few years later. So I definitely think the salaries that we saw last season were somewhat inflated, and it's probably a good idea that they get cut down somewhat, for a couple of reasons, just to make sure the ecosystem is more sustainable long term, and they can actually rise fairly in future years if that does happen. And of course, it also gives the situation of maybe, these players don't feel as comfortable on those living, so maybe they try a little bit harder, and we don't get a situation where they're just like living in money, they're just rolling in the bread, I suppose, and they don't actually put as much effort in as we've talked we've seen Crimsix and Clayster talk about that to some length over the last couple of weeks. You've also got to think about supply and demand to a degree, where the supply of professional players trying to get into only 48 Pro League spots is increasing significantly, right? There's a lot more pro players fighting for those spots, which means it's going to drive the price down. Players are going to be more willing to take a starting spot for less money because there's other guys competing, and well, salary might be an issue when we talk about these players potentially coming onto the teams. So if the average salary last year was something like 120,000, this year I do believe it's going to be significantly below 100,000. In the ballpark, 65, 80, 75, something in that ballpark. Not exactly sure where it's going to land, but it's significantly lower, right? Like the average salary in the league for like an average player on the LAG or something is not going to be significantly higher than 80 grand or something like that, I imagine. Some of these guys will definitely still be capped, like probably Scump and Formula. These guys have signed like 2-year deals, so they're just making the same both years in the situation. But the 1+1 situation has made it kind of interesting, where if you, just to explain the 1+1 contracts real quick. A lot of these players were signed on a 1+1, which means they were signed for Modern Warfare with the opportunity to extend that contract exactly as it was for the upcoming season. And a lot of teams decided not to do that because either they want to re-sign those players for less money or they want to just sign other players for less money. I mean, we saw London, for example, get rid of everyone but Shawnee, but Dylan is still rumoured to come back into the starting lineup. I imagine what's going on there is they played Dylan more than they really would have liked to, and now they're going to release him into free agency and try and re-sign him again. Because if they extended his contract by the 1+1, then they would have to pay him exactly the same as they did in the previous season, and a lot of these guys are looking to renegotiate, I imagine, a lot of these teams, because they probably realised they played a bit too much in the first season on some of these salaries, want to bring them down somewhat, still to a comfortable level. Don't get me wrong, these players can certainly live off these salaries, it's not like they're scrounging by, but definitely less than they have been in, the Modern Warfare season, for example. Intrigued to hear your thoughts on this down in the comment section below. Couple of things really. Do you think this salary drop is a good thing for Call of Duty on the whole? Will they actually rise in future years relative to this? Do you think they actually weren't making as much money as you thought they were? Are they making way more money than you thought they were? And do you think that these salaries should be made public information? Because all I talked about today was speculation. Some of these players might be absolutely on banger contracts that we don't know about. And with Cloud9 kind of taking this lead and the Call of Duty League wanting to become like a proper sport, I suppose, in coming years, that may well be a possibility that we start to see salaries actually be made public, which will certainly be an interesting discussion and really ensure that players are definitely held accountable, not only by the organisation, but also by the audience and the fans. Thanks for watching as always. Like if you guys enjoyed the video, subscribe if you are new, and I will see you next time.